Hello, I'm Bob Denton, and welcome to another conversation. You know, according to the Pew Research Center, public trust in federal government has experienced a consistent decline for over 2 decades, and now at an all-time low of 15%. 65% of Americans think most political candidates run for office to serve their own personal interest, and more than 80% of Americans believe elected officials don't care what people like them think. Has it come time for reconsideration of the concept of moral leadership and civic service? We're joining me in a conversation to explore the concept, characteristics, and benefits of moral leadership to democracy is Dr. Stephen Fesmire, Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Radford University. And thanks so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, before we begin, I want to congratulate you on your new book that you have, Beyond Moral Fundamentalism Toward a Pragmatic Pluralism, with the Oxford University Press. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the book could be called Beyond My Way or the Highway. I think that's the idea. What I call moral fundamentalism is the idea, or really just the habit, of acting as though there's a single right way to think about this moral or political situation, and I have access to that, and there's a single right thing to do that flows from that. So it's like, you know, there's one right diagnosis, and I know what it is, it's mine. And then there's a right prescription that flows from that. And so I end up calling that moral fundamentalism because I think that ends up creating the kind of winner-take-all setup that we have today in our moral and political discourse. So needless to say, this is a critique of that in an attempt to try to create a different sort of social and cultural context.
And it's certainly needed today, certainly in the climate that we're in, without question. And we're going to get to some of that. I guess before we can discuss moral leadership, I guess we got to try to understand a little bit about what does moral mean. In other words, what does morality encompass? Different ways of thinking about that term itself. Is it behavior? Is it knowing right and wrong? Well, who's right, who's wrong? How would you put a perspective in terms of just the concept of morality?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, so I would define the moral as situationally, any situation that calls us to determine better or worse would be a moral situation. Now, the difficulty there is that actually could be any situation. So, you know, should I open the window to let the cool air in? Well, that doesn't sound like a potentially moral situation. We think moral situations have to be about, you know, reproductive ethics, or should I embezzle the money, or should I, steal this bread or this drug to save my family? These are quintessentially moral situations that we think of. But the window could be a moral situation. You know, maybe I'll let a bee in, and my wife is allergic to bees, and then so there may be some issue about how I ought to act there. So that ends up being, I think, important because we often think of moral situations as in a really narrow way, but it may be that there's a moral dimension to many of the situations that we face hour by hour and day by day. So the way I would define it is that the moral asks us, all things considered, how ought we to live? That's the big moral question. How ought we to live, all things considered?
Well, you know, the Pew Research Center, they asked a question, where does morality come from? And I thought it was interesting, and it's surprising to me in a couple of ways. 37% says conscious.
Yeah.
27% says from God. 16% says society, and that's a little disturbing. 9% say comes from science and reason. I guess, and this may be generational for me, but I thought more might have said some sort of religious, and yet it was one's conscience was 37%.
Conscience was the first one that came up, huh?
Yeah.
You know, I mentioned moral fundamentalism earlier, and you can call it what you will, but the idea that that there's a single right way to think about this thing that we're talking about, or a single right way to approach it, is implied in all of the answers here quite often. But suppose you think in terms of conscience, right? That means that what my conscience tells me is the right thing to do. My conscience, follow your conscience. What ought I to do? I should follow my conscience. Philosophers in general are going to be a little suspicious of that one because people's consciences around the world seem to be telling them to do different things, right? And so we have become objectively certain about such a multitude of differing and competing values and concerns and beliefs that we need some way to adjudicate that, right? You've got to be able to separate out what you think holds water and what you think doesn't hold water. And so the idea that I'm just going to follow my conscience and everything's going to be fine, from a philosopher's standpoint, that's a little bit dubious. I'm not so sure. And so philosophers tend to think, well, it's reason, one of those other answers, right? So they tend to think there's some principle, basically, that we have to follow. And that is, they agree with the common view that there's a right way to reason about moral and political questions, and it's mine. But it's this principle or that principle. So famously, Immanuel Kant says, well, yeah, there's a principle. He calls it the categorical imperative, right? That I ought to be able, whatever it is I'm thinking about doing, I ought to be able to state that. Is what he calls a maxim, right? That it's just, I ought to state, and you state it as something that would apply to everybody. Sort of imagine that you're going to think, I'm thinking about lying to get myself off the hook from this uncomfortable social situation. Could you put on a billboard and say, everyone everywhere ought always to lie to escape a social situation that's uncomfortable? And Kant's going to say, well, yeah, that's not going to work, right? And so it looks like you're trying to make an exception of yourself. You want other people to do that, right? But you don't want to really do it yourself. And so he said, therefore it's wrong. Right, so what does this mean? Well, there's a right way to reason about morals. It's to follow the categorical imperative. And then the utilitarians come along and they say, no, that's not right. It's not about following the categorical imperative. It's following the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? One ought always to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number and bring about the maximum amount of social welfare. And that's the right way to reason about morals. I have access to it. Whatever prescriptions follow from that, that's the right thing to do. They both seem completely confident that there's a right way. They've got it worked out. And so although they would be very suspicious of that conscience idea or of a different religion, I know it based on my religion, I know it based on my religion, and those end up conflicting. So they'd be very suspicious about that. They substitute something that looks a lot like my way or the highway. And they would be loath to agree that they're doing so because they think they've got the rational way to approach the problem. People who are being rational will agree with this view. In the book, I'm criticizing both of those actually. The idea that there's a single right way, I've got access to it, and there's a right thing that flows from that, and so you need to do what I'm telling you.
You know, there's an interesting statistic that actually echoes some of what you're saying. How do we see ourselves? 80% of all United States citizens say that they are somewhat or very moral. 80%. I am somewhat or very moral. Ironic, though, citizens think the moral values in the U.S. are weak or very weak at 53%. And it really differs by age. If you're 18 to 45, it's 40%. If you're older than 45, it goes up to 64% of saying, wow, our moral values in America are weak or very weak. And so that seems to be an interesting contrast between those who, like you would say, I know I'm right, 80% says, yeah, I'm somewhat or very moral. And yet, oh, but the world, not quite so. I think that was an interesting juxtaposition there.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of wisdom in those stats that requires some explanation. One of the activities that I do with my ethics students in class might speak to this somewhat. I have them do a couple of activities during the first week. And one of them is, I call it a pledge. You know, like we would raise your hand and put your hand on the Bible maybe and say, I pledge such and such, or you put your hand on the heart, pledge allegiance to the flag, right? And so I asked him, well, would you take this pledge? And then I put up on the projector a pledge, and it says, there's a right way to approach moral and political issues. I have access to that, and there's a single right thing to do that flows from it. That's the stuff that I talked about earlier. But then I go on and I say, therefore, when people disagree with me, they don't have anything to contribute. So their contributions, their participation is at best irrelevant, and at worst an evil to be defeated. I have everything on my radar that needs to be on my radar to deal with whatever problem we're talking about, and there's nothing that someone else has that would contribute to my learning about it. And then I asked them, would you take that pledge? I don't get any takers. Because it seems like closed-minded arrogance to them. Because they're reasonable people, and it's kind of set up to come across that way. They definitely wouldn't sign on to that. But then I ask them, because this is where we get interesting. I say, but do you ever act that way? And I put them in groups, and I ask them to think about a time when they acted as though disagreement with me would be irrelevant, my way or the highway, right? And all of them, it's a reach for some of them, but they end up feeling a little sheepish about it. And the lesson here ends up being, I think, that they fully realize the habits that we parade around for other people to appreciate about us, the people we want to seem to others, is quite distinct from the habits that we betray in our conduct, right? The action is with our acts. And the habits we betray are far more important than the ones that we parade around. And so most people think of themselves as open-minded. And yet, when they think about their actual behavior, they don't do such a good job of it. And I think that sense of dissonance, in fact, a sort of hypocrisy, that we carry that around with us, we're aware that we're not doing such a great job because there's so much daylight between the people we want to become and the people that we're quite aware often we don't act in the way that we think would be consonant with who we want to be. And I think maybe that comes through with some of the stats there.
Yeah, I think it does. And of course, to make things a little bit more controversial, there's party differences drastic in terms of the views of, is the morals weak and very weak? 39% of Democrats say yes, very weak. 53% of independents say yes, America's moral values are weak or very weak. 68% for Republicans.
No.
And that is interesting. Like almost everything, there's a political or party differences. But that's pretty strong.
Those are very strong differences. I think that it may go back in part to your original questions where you had some statistics where people were asked, what's the source of morality, right? If you look at partisan differences, you'll probably see it more popular that people will say that my morality comes from my religion or my morality comes directly from God. Right, that there's a sort of pipeline, right? And I have direct access, maybe through the form of conscience or maybe through some other medium. But there is more of a tendency for Republicans to answer in that way, it appears, based on Gallup polls, than for Democrats to answer that way. And I would assume some of the folks who think values come from, your parents and your a faith community, your friends, your social set, your subculture, from society in this sense, it might be more likely that folks more on the politically progressive side would think that. So that might be a way to address those sorts of differences. The important thing to recognize here, I think, with those partisan differences is there's a tendency on both sides to think they're right. And the right and the left politically are not any more likely to have this moral fundamentalist approach. And I think the statistics would bear this out. That is, the right way to reason about it is my way, whether you're on the political left or you're the political right. And this ends up being a real problem because the problems that we face together, the social goals that we have, like peace and justice and sustainability, security, health, public health, none of these can be achieved on our own, right? One party is not going to be capable of it. And so if we don't learn our way together toward peace and justice and sustainability, we're not going to achieve it at all. And so somehow we have to get beyond those partisan differences and learn and dialogue across those differences, and then we'll be in a much better position. My concern is, how do you create a context to become those kinds of people? The kind of people that, in the words of a friend of mine, how do we become the kind of people that a democracy requires, rather than whatever it is that we seem to be doing right now?
And see, that leads me to, so from a pragmatic and, quote, political science kind of perspective, articulate for me, what is moral leadership? What would that look like? Are there characteristics? I mean, can I say, oh, that's moral leadership? Or what should moral leadership be? The content of it. In other words, integrity, I don't know, honesty, I don't know. I mean, what from your perspective, because you have the philosophical and also from the political, can we even talk about moral leadership? Is it at a 30,000-foot view of saying, I would characterize moral leadership as?
No, that's a great question. First of all, can we talk about moral leadership? I think it's important to recognize, as with, say, art, there's such a thing as bad art. It doesn't mean that it's not. People like to say, well, that's not art. Some new form of music, whatever it is. But actually what they mean is I'm judging it as bad art. So with the moral issues about who we ought to be, the sort of people we ought to become, how we ought to live, all things considered, those sorts of questions we can do really badly in our moral lives. We can make bad decisions. So moral leadership could be that you're giving moral leadership and it's very negative. And so we could look at anyone and say the way that they're influencing people's decisions about how they live their lives and who they want to be, or the sort of character they want to cultivate, that is moral leadership. It's bad moral leadership, perhaps, in this case. Or maybe it's good moral leadership over in this case. So I'm not sure that moral leadership as a category is something that necessarily is good or bad in itself. So though it ends up being, what kind of moral leadership are we talking about? Are we talking about the kind that's going to help us to meet the problems that we face right now, to give what's best in ourselves, to meet the situations that we face? Well, I hope the answer is yes. So the question, I think, it becomes, well, what are the traits of character? What are the habits, the virtues? Many philosophers would like to say, what are the virtues we need to cultivate to meet the situations that we need to face right now? And then we go back, we start with the sorts of virtues you talked about. Integrity, great example of that. Thoughtfulness, honesty, trustworthiness. These are classic, generosity, right? These sorts of classic virtues we've been talking about for thousands of years. We don't need to leave those behind. We need them very much today. There is one that I want to emphasize, though, in light of everything else that I've said. A sense of fallibility seems to be lacking. That is a sort of fallibilism where we recognize that whatever conclusion we've come to and whatever we're recommended, some doubt plausibly remains that maybe I'm missing something, that maybe somebody else could put on my radar. Someone else may be noticing my own blind spots. And there's always blind spots. And there's no way out. There's no way that I'm exhaustively noticing everything that I need. And so I need a sense of fallibilism, a sense that I may not have it all worked out. And if people, whether from partisan divides or just in a marital relationship, parents and children, if people just had a sense of fallibility and expressed that, right, in the way that they approach their conversations and their interactions, I think that would create the kind of context that we need to deliberate better, to be more mindful and thoughtful, to be more responsible. And that would put us in a position to actually meet the situation that we need to meet, especially complicated, really messy situations from climate change to, more run-of-the-mill standard moral situations like reproductive choices.
So social relativism, again, I'm a baby boomer. It's got to be a little bit more kind of concrete. I mean, I would like to think, so in 2005, I wrote a book called Moral Leadership in American Presidency. What stimulated me in writing that book was where Clinton was trying to make the argument that, what's public is public and my job, but what's private is private. And it's hard, and that just struck me like, my goodness. And then I went and explored why I thought that was bad thinking going forward. And I don't understand evangelicals perhaps as it relates to Donald Trump, but of course, as a friend told me, we're not electing the Pope. And so I guess I believe that moral leadership is essential to public leadership, especially in a democracy.
No.
But that means we can define it, see? So you put me in a little bit of a dilemma here. So what do you say to Denton in terms of that little tension or dilemma? Maybe I'm seeking too much of ABC, or certainly moral leadership is good. We would want that, especially in a democracy, to be value-oriented. Would you think that would be the case?
Yeah, I think it is the case. And I think we can specify the sorts of characteristics, habits of character, we could say, that are going to be most needful, right? And I was listing some of those earlier, and some of them are the classic virtues. And I think we can specify that, and we can do that in a way that's not just subjective, it's not just up for grabs, it's not arbitrary, it's not loosey-goosey. It's objective in the sense that it will allow us to meet those situations well and responsibly. So I think we can specify that. But I think as long as we approach it with a sense of fallibility that I mentioned before, what are we missing even in our conception of moral leadership that someone else might be able to put on our radar? Then I think we're going to be in pretty good shape about that. So it may be that we don't disagree that much. Regarding Bill Clinton's public and private split, this idea that there's a complete dichotomy between the kind of character that I have in my private interactions and in my public actions is not one that anyone who thinks about virtues or has been reading up over the last few thousand years of what philosophers call virtue theory is going to have much truck with. The notion that there's some Grand Canyon in between the public you and the private you is just a non-starter. The way that we express our private habits spills over always and is expressed in our public lives. So that just sounds like a self-justifying rationalization for doing whatever the heck he wanted to do. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for drawing that kind of split.
Yeah. So we only have like 3 minutes or so remaining. Is there a correlation between we think if we feel there's a decline in morals in society with what we get? In other words, our leaders are only going to be as good as the people concept of Jimmy Carter. Why not the best? You see what I'm trying to say? And so I tend to, dated probably, but there is a correlation as our society and culture gets more, we kind of start getting a different types of leaders perhaps, and we get perhaps what we deserve. We got a couple of minutes. Thoughts on that?
Do we get the leaders that we deserve? Well, I hope not.
See, that's a dilemma, isn't it?
Well, it is a dilemma. One of the things that here's an image that I really appreciate. It's from a Chinese philosopher, a Confucian philosopher, a couple of thousand years ago, Chuang-Tzu, and he talked about the frog sitting at the bottom of a well, looking up at the sky. Now the frog in the well sees the sky, right? There's that patch of sky, but the frog thinks that that is the sky. The only sky that's worthy of consideration is the patch that he's seeing there from the bottom of the well. The tendency that we have is to think not that we're frogs in the well, but that we're seeing the entirety of the sky. Now that ends up being an anti-democratic view. If you behave as though you're seeing the entirety of what you need to be noticing to make the best moral choices that we can, and the best political choices that we can, the best policies that we can, the best laws that we can, then that approach is probably not going to be very helpful to us. That's the kind of moral fundamentalism that I talk about in the book. I think we're all frogs in the well, but that doesn't mean that we're not seeing a patch of sky that's worthy of our consideration. The problem becomes, how do we put these patches of sky in connection with each other? How do we open ourselves to diverse voices and backgrounds and interests and diverse life experiences, cultural experiences, languages? How do we open ourselves to that and create that kind of context for communication across all those differences and partisan differences as well? That's the challenge of democracy today. The greatest challenge of the 21st century as far as democracy is concerned is how do we communicate and make decisions across differences. And that's where that sense of a sort of fallibilism comes into play. But it doesn't mean relativism, it doesn't mean anything loosey-goosey or arbitrary. It just means that I'm going to have courage, and I will stand for my convictions, and I will die for them, but I'm always going to have this sense of never, ever not quite. That something is escaping my notice, and I'm going to go into this dialogue or this political debate or this family conversation with the sense that I'm failing to notice something. And if we approach things that way, I think we're going to be a lot better off.
Well said. Believe it or not, our time is up. Very fascinating, insightful. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, I want to thank you for joining us and hope you do so again for the next Conversation with Bob Denton.